It's spring in Washington, D.C., which means peak 8th grade field trip season is right around the corner. If you're gonna be here, you should watch this video because I've got a lot of tips to help navigate around these groups. Before we get into the specifics, hello, my name is Rob. I'm a tour guide and the founder of Trip Hacks DC Tours. On this channel, I share my best tips, tricks, and hacks for visitors who want to explore Washington, D.C. And I'm curious to know, did you come to Washington, D.C. on a field trip when you were in middle school or high school? Leave a comment down there and let me know what you remember from it. Over the years, I've gotten a lot of comments and a lot of messages about people who want to know two things about field trip groups. One, when are they here? And two, how do I avoid them? I'm going to answer both questions, but first, I think it's important to talk about who these groups are, why they're here, and what they're trying to accomplish. In many schools, a field trip to Washington, D.C. is a bit of a rite of passage. These trips are typically done in the 8th grade as a final send-off before high school. And historically, they were mostly done in the spring towards the end of the school year. Generally, schools that are within driving or busing distance of Washington, D.C. make this field trip. Schools that are not within busing distance may still send a field trip, though the logistics of putting a whole class on a flight is a lot more challenging. So instead, many farther away schools do a field trip to their state capital or a national park or something like that. These field trips are not typically planned by teachers or principals or school administrators. There are a small number of very big companies whose entire business is student travel. For schools, these companies offer a great value because the teachers and administrators don't really have to do anything. They just pay one price per student and everything's included. The bus, the tour guide, the hotel, the activities. However, some schools are too small for these companies and they wind up doing a field trip that's organized by the social studies teacher or the school principal. Now, I've seen more than a few school trip itineraries over the years, and one thing they almost always have in common is that they are packed to the brim. Sometimes an entire week's worth of stuff packed into only 3 or 4 days. So these groups are up early and out late because they have to be if they're going to squeeze all this stuff in. And all of that is to say that they're kind of unavoidable to some extent. But if you're smart about planning your trip, you won't have to compete with them everywhere you go. So let's talk about where these groups stay to help you choose a hotel. Most field trip groups stay at budget brand hotels in the suburbs, often the ones on the side of the interstate. Think hotels like the Hampton Inn, Spring Hill Suites, Holiday Inn, next to the Beltway in Virginia. These hotels are attractive to field trip groups because they're basic, inexpensive, and have lots of rooms with 2 beds. And importantly, a big parking lot where their charter bus can load, unload, and park. Field trip groups typically do not stay in the city because downtown hotels tend to be more expensive and have fewer rooms with 2 beds. The exception to this are the really small schools, who often do stay downtown because they're not traveling around on a charter bus, so having a walkable central location is actually important. If you haven't seen it yet, I have an entire guide with 11 areas where I recommend staying. And if you pick a hotel from that guide, you probably won't have too many teenagers staying at your hotel. Now let's talk about transportation and how these groups move around. For the most part, field trip groups travel by charter bus. And trust me, this is a good thing. You really do not want groups of 100 kids all trying to navigate on the metro during rush hour. So if you're planning on mostly getting around using public transportation, you won't find too many of those groups down there with you. Now, let's talk about what types of activities these groups typically do. Student groups do all the headline tourist activities. You'll see them at the Capitol. You'll see them at museums. You'll see them at the monuments and memorials. You'll see them at the National Archives, Arlington Cemetery, all the standard places. When it comes to museums, student groups tend to focus heavily on the big 3: air and space, natural history, and American history. You'll find fewer of them at the less popular museums like the National Postal Museum or the National Gallery of Art. To be clear, you'll probably still see some field trip groups at these places, just fewer of them. At the monuments and memorials, you will often find the heaviest presence of these groups early in the morning and later in the evening, which surprises some people but makes total sense when you think about it. When you have an overpacked itinerary, you have to do all this stuff that's open from 10 to 5 between 10 and 5. And the monuments and memorials are open 24/7. This is a big part of the reason why my private tour of the monuments departs at 5 p.m. rather than later in the evening, because that hour between 5 and 6 is a little quieter as the field trips regroup, get some dinner before heading back out. And as the evening wears on, their presence increases. Now, let's talk about where these groups eat and what restaurants you'll find them in. There are actually not a lot of restaurants in Washington, D.C. that are both budget-friendly and can accommodate groups of 50 or more. So there are a relatively small number of restaurants where these groups go. This includes the Hard Rock Cafe, Buca di Beppo, and Carmine's. Student groups eat a lot of meals at food courts. In 2023, the main food courts still standing are L'Enfant Plaza, Union Station, and the Reagan Building on Pennsylvania Avenue. And in the suburbs, Pentagon City Mall. Pentagon City Mall is like the headquarters for 8th grade field trips. It's a big mall with a big food court in the suburbs with bus parking, somewhat in between the sites in DC and where the groups are staying. So if you go to this mall or any of the food courts I mentioned, be ready to stand in line behind a lot of field trips. But if you're looking for places to eat where they might not go, you should check out my favorite cheap eats video. Just go ahead and click or tap right over here. Enjoy your trip.